Forget the winters, you know. There was no fireplace glow, no warm tea in your hands, no snowflakes falling gently outside a quiet window. For medieval peasants, winter wasn't cozy, it wasn't beautiful, it was a sentence, a harsh, silent judgment passed down by nature, year after year. As soon as the last leaves fell, and cold winds swept across the empty fields, fear would creep into every home. A silent, invisible guest that never knocked, just entered. Each day became shorter. Each night, longer, colder, darker. When the sun set, it was as if a heavy, wet blanket fell over the village, one that did not offer comfort, only weight. And under that weight, people didn't sleep. They simply endured. The homes they lived in were made of mud, straw, and scraps of wood, the simplest materials they could gather. There was no glass in the windows, no insulation, just animal hides stretched over open frames, and cracks in the walls stuffed with damp straw. When the wind blew, and it always did, it came in from all sides. Sometimes, it was colder inside than it was outside. And so, at night, families would huddle in the dark, near the last glowing embers of a fire. They'd listen to the wind howl at the door, and hope it wouldn't find a way in. Because winter brought more than cold. It brought hunger. It brought illness. It brought silence. Roads would freeze. Villages would become isolated. And if your family ran out of wood, or food, or if your fire died in the middle of the night, you might not make it to morning. To them, winter wasn't a season. It was a reminder that nature does not offer kindness, only challenge. Survival wasn't luck, it was effort, preparation, endurance, clinging to every last bit of warmth. So each day they lived through winter. Each sunrise that followed a frozen, sleepless night was a quiet victory. A whisper of resilience from people history almost forgot. But they endured. And that is how they survived the cold. In the harsh medieval world, where nature showed little mercy to the poor, clothing was not fashion. It wasn't about beauty, or class, or identity. It was survival. A fragile layer, standing between your skin and the winter winds, that could slice through bone. There were no padded coats, no synthetic insulation, no weatherproof boots. What they had was wool, rough, itchy, heavy wool, spun from sheep by hand, woven with patience, and worn like armor. Layer by layer, they dressed: a simple shirt, a short coat, a long cloak, belts, scarves, wool socks, sometimes even cloth bags tied around their feet to hold in the heat. If they were lucky, they had furs, a thick hide, stitched together to block the wind and hold warmth close. Cloth was precious. Each piece came from hours, sometimes weeks, of spinning, weaving, cutting, and sewing. It took families working together just to make one garment. A shirt might pass from father to son, from sister to sister, patched, restitched, and worn through many winters. They didn't wash their clothes in winter. The water was too cold, soap was too rare, and they believed the dirt, sweat, and oil actually helped keep them warm. Their clothes were not colorful. No bright reds or brilliant blues, just earth tones, browns, grays, deep greens, dyed with bark, mud, and ash. Children, too, were bundled in layers, sometimes scraps, sometimes old adult clothes, sewn smaller by a mother's tired hands. They were wrapped tightly, like little cocoons, to keep warmth from escaping through their skin. And when it was time to sleep, they didn't change. They kept their clothes on, because what they wore was the only blanket they had. In the darkness of a medieval winter, Every layer of cloth was a small act of defiance. Every cloak, every thread, whispered to the cold, "I'm still here. I'm still alive." When night fell, and the eastern wind howled beyond the wooden door, something as simple as sleep became a quiet battle. There were no sturdy wooden beds, no soft pillows, no feather quilts, or clean linen sheets, no mattress. What they had was straw and scraps and trash. Their mattress was made from whatever could be found nearby: dried grass, moldy leaves, shredded cloth, sometimes even kitchen waste, vegetable peels or old grain mash. The straw soon began to rot. It held moisture from the earth, and from human breath. It grew warm and wet, and it stank. It became the perfect home for life, but not the kind you'd want. Lice, fleas, bedbugs, even rats. Each night they stirred, while the family tried to sleep above them. Lying down was not restful. It was itchy. It was noisy. It was painful. Children were most at risk. Soft skin, weak resistance, but no choice but to lie beside their parents, on the same dirty straw. Still, it was the only place to rest. After a day in the frozen fields, with numb feet and cracked hands, even a pile of trash felt like a small relief. They curled up in old clothes stiff with use, pulled their knees to their chest, huddled like small animals, clinging to the fading warmth of their own bodies. And somehow, they still dreamed, not of magical lands, but of simple things: a clean bed, a warm blanket, a room without smoke, and without insects. But when morning came, they woke up in the same mud hut, on the same damp straw, beside the same shivering loved ones. Sleep for the medieval peasant was not rest. It was another challenge, in a life full of them. But still they slept, and still they endured. And in that quiet resilience, they left a mark, worth remembering. If there was one thing that kept a medieval peasant alive through winter, it wasn't a sword, or a plow, or a millstone. It was fire. In those small homes, made of mud and wood, there was no chimney, no stove, no fireplace. The fire was lit directly on the dirt floor, in a simple circle of stones. There was no vent, no escape for the smoke. It crept into everything: walls, clothing, blankets, even their hair. It stung their eyes. It burned their lungs. Children had red, watering eyes. Adults coughed throughout the night, but no one complained, because they all knew, without fire, the cold would win. Fire was not just for cooking. It was a gathering place, a source of light, a shield against the night. Families would huddle close to it, sometimes even sleep beside it, just to soak in every last bit of warmth. Its smoke drove away flies, mosquitoes, fleas. Its flickering light scared off rats, foxes, even wolves. A home without a fire was a home that had been abandoned. If you walked through a village and saw smoke rising from a thatched roof, you knew someone was still alive in there. But fire is not eternal. It must be fed, watched, tended. Someone, usually an old woman or a mother, would stay awake through the night, adding wood, stirring embers, making sure it never went out. Because if it did, starting it again could take hours. If there was any dry wood left at all, and if there wasn't, then all that remained was the cold. That small flame, quiet and trembling, was the heart of the home. It beat with tiny cracks and pops. It breathed through smoke and ash, and it lived because someone refused to let it die. In the frozen silence of a medieval winter night, while everything else slept beneath layers of darkness and frost. One thing still glowed: the fire. And always, there was someone who did not sleep: the fire watcher. It wasn't a grand duty. It wasn't glorious. But it was the thin line between life and death. In those times, starting a fire was no easy task. There were no matches, no lighters, no gas stoves. To light a flame, you needed flint and steel, striking them again and again, just to catch a tiny spark. Then coaxing it to life, in a bundle of dry straw, gently breathing, until the ember became a flame. And if the fire died in the middle of the night, when the wind howled, when the straw was damp, when your hands were too cold to hold the stone, you might never light it again. So they didn't let the fire die, ever. Each night, one member of the family was chosen to keep watch. They would sit beside the fading coals, wrapped in layers, half asleep, clutching a small piece of wood. When the fire dimmed, they stirred the ash, they added fuel, they leaned in close, and whispered breath into the embers. There were no alarms, no shifts, no written schedule, just understanding. Some households took turns, each person watching for a few hours. Others had only one person, an elder, perhaps, who sat alone through the dark, night after night, until the thaw of spring. Sometimes, the fire watcher would drift off, just for a moment, and the fire would die. The family would wake in the dark, in the piercing cold. So, despite the exhaustion, despite the burning eyes and heavy heads, they kept watch, because they knew, in the unfeeling cold of a medieval winter, a small red ember was the only thing they could hold on to, and the only thing still holding on to them. In the dead of a medieval winter, there was never enough space in the hut, but always too much cold. The chill crept in through every crack, settled in every breath, wrapped itself around sleep, like a quiet predator waiting in the dark. To survive those long and bitter nights, peasants turned to a simple strategy. They lay close together. Cows, goats, and dogs, if there was room, were brought inside, not out of affection, but for warmth. And though their fur was dirty, though they smelled of dung and dust, no one minded. There was no privacy, no personal space, but there was something else, something deeply human: connection. In that crowded space, warmth didn't just come from flesh. It came from love, from breath shared in the dark, from the simple truth that you were not alone. Families lived together, slept together, and dreamed together. Even if those dreams were filled with lice, straw dust, and the heavy breath of cattle. No one was comfortable, but everyone was needed. Survival wasn't individual anymore. It belonged to the whole. So every night, in that small, muddy hut, people, dogs, cattle, lay down together and waited for morning. Not all of them woke, but those who did had held on to one another. And within those crowded, restless nights, there remained something fragile and precious: hope. As the sun sank behind a line of bare trees, and the darkness wrapped itself around the damp thatched huts, one quiet question returned again and again: what will we eat tonight, to stay warm enough to sleep? In the world of medieval peasants, dinner wasn't a moment of pleasure. It was a strategy. They didn't eat to enjoy the taste. They ate to endure the night. Food had to be heavy. It had to sit in the belly and last through the coldest hours, because once the body grew cold, an empty stomach could be fatal. The most common meal was a thick porridge or stew, made from whatever was still left: turnips, kale, dried onions, beans, millet, or barley. These root vegetables were stored from autumn, or pulled from a dirt cellar when needed. They were no longer fresh, sometimes soft, sometimes sour, but still edible. Meat was rare. Usually, they added a bit of pork fat, or a dried bone, simmered over and over again since Monday. Dark bread always came with it. Not soft, not white. It was hard, coarse, made from rye or barley flour, sometimes stretched with chaff to make it last. By the third day, the bread was as hard as stone, so they soaked it in the stew, softening it just enough to chew. In the faint golden glow, with the sound of spoons tapping an iron pot, and a soft sigh of warmth, as food spread through the body, they felt, for a moment, alive. They only hoped that one last spoonful of soup, and one last piece of bread, might carry them safely through the night. And maybe, if they were lucky, they'd gather again tomorrow. Inhale, exhale. It sounds simple, automatic, something you do thousands of times a day without thinking. But in the medieval winter, how you breathed could decide whether you woke up the next morning. Inside those damp, low huts made of mud and straw, the air was thick with smoke, moisture, and the scent of mold that never truly left. There were no windows to open, no chimneys to carry the smoke away. So in many medieval villages, children were taught how to breathe, not as a calming technique, but as a survival skill. Don't breathe through your mouth. Don't gasp when you step into the wind. Breathe through your nose, slowly, gently, steadily. Breathing the wrong way in winter could lead to a cough, and that cough could become something worse, pneumonia. And in those days, there was no syrup, no pills, no cure. That's why mothers whispered to their children before sleep. Through your nose, little one, nice and slow. Don't blow too hard. Pull the blanket up to your nose. Even adults learned to guard their breath. When they woke in the cold, they didn't sit up. They didn't gasp. They stayed still, pulling in warmth, one breath at a time. In a world where each breath might carry infection, chill, and danger, learning how to breathe was a kind of wisdom, not from books, but from experience, from fear, from love. Today, we take breathing for granted, but for our ancestors, each breath in winter was an act of caution, a quiet hope that maybe, just maybe, they would live to see the spring. The roof above their heads was made from bundles of straw, held down with wooden beams, sometimes coated in mud, to help seal the cold away. But when the snow came heavy, the roof grew heavy too, damp-soaked, cold. Water would drip, one drop at a time, onto a pot of soup, or onto someone's sleeping face. Drip, drip, each drop like the ticking clock of poverty. If there was a window, it wasn't made of glass. It was a hole, covered with stretched animal hide, or a rough piece of wood. Light could barely enter, but the wind and cold, they always found their way in. When the northern wind blew, the entire hut shivered, like a weak and wounded creature, trying to outlast the storm. The floor was packed dirt, no stones, no rugs, no warmth. When it rained, the floor turned soft and wet. When it froze, it was as hard and cold as stone. And still, people ate there, slept there, gave birth there. Everything happened on that cold, living earth. Beneath their feet, the space was tight, straw piled in corners, cooking pots beside drying clothes, animals near the door, stored food beside sleeping children. There were no walls dividing rooms, no privacy, no quiet, just one shared box of breath and heat and hope. And still, Despite the cracked walls, the leaking roof, the open window that never truly closed, they called it home. Because home wasn't built from bricks or boards. It was built from people. In the bitter cold of a medieval winter, when even the walls of your home seemed to shiver in the wind, no one could survive alone. Nature would break you if you were isolated. If one household had firewood, they would share a few sticks. If another had extra potatoes, half the basket went to a neighbor. Not from wealth, but from knowing today you give, tomorrow you might need. When a family's fire went out in the night, a neighbor crossed the muddy yard to offer a glowing coal. If a child grew sick, neighbors would bring herbs, or simply a warm hand on a weary shoulder. No hospitals, no rescue system, only each other. They knew each other's names and stories. They farmed, built, and survived together. Every winter survived was a shared victory. There were unwritten rules. Don't let someone starve when you still have a potato. Don't let someone freeze when your fire still burns. There are still stories of old men fed by the whole village, widows warmed by shared firewood, orphans passed from lap to lap until spring returned. The cold didn't grow softer, but hearts grew warmer, in clasped hands and shared looks. Something stronger than fire kept them alive. In the frozen silence of winter, when all light seemed to fade, faith became the second fire, not of wood, but of whispered prayer and candlelight. Medieval peasants were born, lived, and died in the same village, faced with hunger, sickness, and storms. They turned their hearts toward heaven. After supper, they prayed together. Not from books, but memory. Simple words passed from mother to child. Please keep our fire alive. Please let us see the sun tomorrow. On the wall, a worn wooden cross or a faded image of the Virgin. These were not decorations. They were windows to something greater. A single candle burned at night, to ward off spirits, to bring peace. They believed even the smallest flame could hold death at bay. Parents made the sign of the cross on sleeping children. Some left bread for ancestors. Some wrote saints' names in soot on doors. Acts of hope in a hopeless world. That faith, quiet and unshaken, carried them through countless winters. A light that needed no spark, no wood, only a soul that still hoped. Not every winter was the same. Some years, the snow came late. The winds were kind. There was just enough left in storage, and people survived. But there were other years. Years when the cold came early. Sudden, uninvited. Like a silent guest that slipped into every home and brought an entire village to its. Medieval peasants had no forecasts, no understanding of climate cycles or shifting patterns. All they had were the skies above, the sound of the wind. And then, one morning, they opened the door to find snow already blanketing their thatched roofs. The air sliced their lungs like knives, and they knew this would be a bad year. Some winters, the weight of snow crushed the straw roofs in the night, burying entire families as they slept. Some nights, the wind was so fierce, it snuffed out the last fire, and come morning, a mother might be found holding her two frozen children, still, as if in sleep. In some villages, just 3 weeks into the cold, half the people were gone. Winter's death made no sound. It did not roar like war. It arrived slowly, through the cracks in the mud walls, in each breath, in each fading candle flame. First, it took the frail, the elderly, the infants, the sick. Then it came for the stronger, when there was no more wood, no more food, no one left to share with. Sometimes, it wasn't even hunger or cold that took them, but despair. When the sun hadn't shone for days, When no child's cry broke the silence each morning, when the soup pot held only water and salt, and the hearth had gone cold for 3 days straight, some gave up in their minds, long before their bodies did. But perhaps the greatest sorrow was not the passing of one person, it was the silence, when an entire village vanished. Even today, there are places where only stones remain. A patch of earth where a house once stood, a collapsed wall, and a line in some ancient record that simply reads, "Abandoned after the winter of 1348. There were no goodbyes, no gravestones, but traces remain, in blackened wood, in sunken earth, and in the memory of mankind itself." They lived, they struggled, they hoped, until the very last night. And it's those quiet tragedies, the ones with no names, that remind us, each warm winter we enjoy today, each peaceful night we lay down to sleep, is a gift we must never take for granted. Because once, not so long ago, in fragile huts, beneath falling snow and fading firelight, some gave everything, just to survive one more night.